Welcome to the Clayton Tyner podcast, where I help you view current issues through the lens of the ancient wisdom of Scripture. This week, we look back on the life of Friends star Matthew Perry. While he is most widely known as Chandler Bing, his most impactful work came later in life after battling through severe addiction. We will celebrate the work he did and look at his thoughts on God's role in all of it. As the NBA season kicks off, troubled star James Harden has been traded to the Los Angeles Clippers following a drama-filled stint with the 76ers. Harden has taken on a reputation as a toxic teammate and a selfish star. Is someone's outward talent ever worth their toxic traits? In political news, former New York Governor Andrew Cuomo appeared on Overtime with Bill Maher, where he was pressed on his COVID policies that led to thousands of elderly deaths. Bill lobbed Cuomo a softball where he could own the decision and apologize. Instead, the governor misdirected and obfuscated, taking no ownership of his policies. We will look at why it is so difficult for leaders to own their own mistakes. All that in one segment, giving some theological and historical perspective on the Israel-Hamas war. The public is taking sides, with pro-Palestine marches gathering hundreds of thousands of people in countries all around the world. What ancient root causes is this tension actually founded on? The answer may surprise you. Let's find out together on episode 38 of the Clayton Tyner podcast. Welcome to episode 38. So thankful for everyone who has been rocking with the show. Don't forget to subscribe. If you are new to the channel, what we do here on the Clayton Tyner podcast is we look at current events in the news trending throughout the week, and we take a biblical ancient wisdom perspective on them. And what this helps us do is to kind of get out of our often very entrenched ideological divisions and find some nuance in the middle of these topics. We approach them with grace, but we try to cling to the truth. Now, if you are a subscriber, you're someone who follows the podcast closely, we have a great opportunity for you to join us on Patreon, patreon.com/Clayton Tyner. That's Clayton, Tyner. If you don't know, Patreon is a site that lets you help support people who are putting on all different forms of art, including things like podcasts. And in exchange, you get some benefits as well. You can join up at patreon.com/Clayton Tyner. You can get exclusive access to Patreon only content. You can get early access to certain videos. You also can sign up to get a monthly live Q&A, where instead of me just talking to you through the screen, we all jump into a Google Meet together and can spend some time talking through some interesting topics. So I'm very excited about it. It costs a little bit of money to actually just run the podcast and to try and continue to improve it. So anything that comes in is super helpful. And I'm hoping to build a cool community over there. We have some really important topics to get to today. So without further ado, let's get into our 3 points. Well, many people were saddened by the passing of Friends star Matthew Perry. He was, of course, Chandler Bing on the very, very famous 90s sitcom Friends, and he lost his life. I was never a huge Friends fan, to be honest. I know the general thread and kind of the relational ties on the show. I've obviously seen a lot of episodes, and Chandler, a lot of people made this point. He was kind of the heart of the show, and Matthew Perry is best known for that role. But I think his most significant contributions to the world at large came later in life, after struggling through extreme addiction as a celebrity and coping with all of the things from being a celebrity and trauma from his past and everything else, having some near-death experiences and becoming sober and helping other people experience that as well. And like so many people who have stories of coming out of addiction, part of his story was spiritual transformation. The Christian Post says Matthew Perry recounted encounter with the presence of God in his book Before Death. Actor Matthew Perry, famously known for his role as Chandler Bing in the hit NBC sitcom Friends, died in his Los Angeles area home at the age of 54 on Saturday. And since the news of his death, the actor's comments about God and the afterlife have resurfaced. In his 2022 memoir, Friends, Lovers, and The Big Terrible Thing. Perry is very candid about his past addiction issues and near-death experience following a burst colon due to opioid abuse. Perry had undergone 14 stints in rehab, 15 stomach surgeries, and dozens of attempts at detox. In his autobiography, Perry revealed that at his lowest point, he turned to God in desperation. "God, please help me. Show me that you are here," he recalled praying. Following the prayer, he described having an encounter with the presence of God, which caused him to weep uncontrollably. "I wasn't crying because I was sad. I was crying because for the first time in my life, I felt okay," he noted. "I felt safe and taken care of. He saved me that day and for all days, no matter what," Perry testified. The comedic performer revealed that up until that point, he spent years struggling with faith, but that encounter changed everything for him. And this isn't the only time that he is on record talking about this. He frequently talked about his faith. And one time he sat down to talk about his memoir and to talk about the book with famous atheist Bill Maher. We'll take a look at how that interaction went.
First of all, I'm so glad you're here. Plugging a book, because a lot of people did have you in the Deadpool.
Yeah.
Maybe you.
Yeah. I had a horrible accident about 7 years ago. I was given a 2% chance to survive the night. They didn't tell me that, obviously, because I wasn't really there, but they told my family. And I was put on a thing called an ECMO machine, which you, having read the book, you would know what that is.
Yes.
But it's
No, I did. I took notes. I underlined it.
Oh, no, I believe you. But they call that a Hail Mary. That's what they do when they put you on an ECMO machine when it's a Hail Mary. And 5 people were on ECMO that night, and the other 4 died, and I somehow made it.
Well, God is a fan.
Yeah, I mean, I know your feeling about that, but I know that
I'm a fan. Maybe I'm God.
Okay. I know that once you've referred to it as a force, and
Very interesting that
I believe
when push comes to shove, even Bill Maher, who is famous for being an atheist. I mean, obviously he's famous for being a political commentator, but he's the one who, put on the whole documentary about how, Christianity is just so silly. It's the dumbest thing. When he talks about the Christian religion, he paints it like it is just the absolute arena for morons and rubes and people who are too dumb to do anything other than just put their faith in some kind of fairy tale. And yet, when he hears a testimony of somebody, like we just read, 14 stints in rehab, 15 stomach surgeries, should have died that night. People don't even know how he didn't die that night. 8 different people were in the same situation. He's the only one who made it. And Bill Maher, who does not believe in God, still just automatically, almost subconsciously, before he can even catch it coming out of his mouth, has to say, God must be a fan of yours. I like how Matthew Perry goes on to confront Bill about how he doesn't actually even believe in God, and then has an interesting take at talking with this famous atheist about it.
I believe that a higher power, there is a higher power.
Right.
I believe I've a very close relationship with him that's helped me a lot. And
somebody's on your side.
Yeah.
Everybody's on your side. Everybody's glad you're here.
Yeah.
And I must say, the human body, reading that book, and I did.
So he says, Bill, I know how you feel about the whole God thing, and it's kind of a joke. And then he talks about it in terms that Bill can understand, that it is this higher power. And people understand that because that's the first of the 12 steps, is your life has become unmanageable. And in the first couple of steps, you have to admit to some kind of higher power just for your life to be manageable. But he says, him. I believe in him. And so not just this higher power, not a pronounless force out there, not something that is impersonal, not a deist view where it's just, the universe, man, or, whatever's out there. It's a him. And we know from his other statements that his actual belief is in God. And his overcoming of addiction says so much about him and what he was able to give the end of his life to. And it speaks to the redemption that comes from faith in God. Often your greatest contribution to the world can be found in the redemption of your weakest seasons of life. And this is a theme throughout Scripture, that your weakest seasons and your worst moments and your biggest disappointments all of those that we see as setbacks can actually become setups for your greatest contribution to the world. And that comes from spiritual renewal. There is a clip from Jordan Peterson, who is known, as someone who comments a lot on political matters and social matters. But before anything, he was an educator. And this is an older video of him, and it's a lecture that he was giving. And I want you to hear how he talks about addiction.
The addiction has a cognitive component. It's full of thoughts and desires and wants. And, you may have to rebuild your whole personality in order to get that thing cornered. Religious conversion, for example, is a really effective treatment for alcoholism. That's partly why Alcoholics Anonymous works for the people for whom it does work. But religious conversion, which is total personality conversion, is actually one of the few things that we know of that's an effective treatment for alcoholism. We don't know how to.
One of the few things that we know, and in more recent days, I've heard Jordan Peterson say that some form of spiritual conversion, spiritual transformation, is really the only thing that truly works to get people off some of the higher levels of addiction. And alcoholism is certainly very, very serious addiction. It reminds me of what Paul wrote to the church in Rome. He said, "Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, and then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is." And Jordan Peterson, he spent years studying specifically alcoholism. He is from a pretty remote province in Canada where it's very dark and very cold for a big portion of the year. Somewhat like in other areas like that, alcoholism is rampant, and he studied it. He wanted to understand it. And he says that the addiction almost has a behavior, it almost has a personality to it, and that the renewal has to happen by this transformation of your mind. And this is exactly how Paul says to transform your life. It's not from the outside in. It's not from what you can accomplish by your own will or skill sets or behaviors. It's from the inside out, the renewing of your mind. And a lot of people, they get to these dark seasons and they have these deep regrets and these things that they're just not proud of in their life. And some people become despondent, kind of give up on life altogether, and they allow it to create guilt, and that guilt spirals in their life. And typically guilt spirals end up pushing you right back to the very behaviors that are causing the guilt in the first place. And the story of redemption and the promise of spiritual renewal is that the worst seasons of your life can actually be the very root of your greatest impact in the world. One time, Jesus showed up and healed a demon-possessed man. And once he is healed in Mark's gospel, Jesus didn't let him come back with him because he had work to do where he was. He said, "Go home to your own people and report to them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you, because your greatest contribution to the world is often found in the redemption of your weakest seasons." And Jesus meets the woman at the well, and she's an outcast from society. And a lot of that's actually not her fault culturally. And he meets her out there in the heat of the day because she's presumably too embarrassed to go and draw her water in the cool of the evening or the cool of the morning when the rest of the women would have done that. She's out there by herself, and she ends up meeting Jesus, and Jesus offers her eternal life. And John's gospel in chapter 4 says she goes back and tells everyone about this guy. "I met this guy and he told me everything about me. He understood everything about me." He actually saw her, and she becomes like one of the very first evangelists. Here's what the Apostle Paul wrote to the church in Corinth: "My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is perfected in weakness. Therefore," Paul says, "I will most gladly boast all the more about my weakness. I take pleasure in weakness, insults, hardships, persecutions, and in difficulties for the sake of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong." And as we mourn the loss of and celebrate the life of Matthew Perry, I thank God that he found faith and that he used this massive setback in this long, drawn-out season of pain and suffering, addiction, just going down further and further into darkness. And he used that to turn that around and influence so many people. And he brought a lot of people happiness with his character, Chandler Bing, on the show Friends. But I think his greatest work actually came from the contributions he made, helping other people find hope in the midst of their addictions. In the NBA, James Harden has been a bit of a problem child pretty much throughout his career. All the way back on his first team, the Oklahoma City Thunder. They had a great run. It was a young babyface Russell Westbrook. It was James Harden right when he had grown the beard. It was Kevin Durant. They were a super team and nobody even knew it. And after that, all three of them started getting paid big bucks. They became the stars of their own teams respectively. But James Harden had some habits that started to emerge, like not bothering to really ever play defense almost at all, showing up to camps overweight and out of shape, not getting along with teammates very well, not facilitating the basketball on the court, talking poorly about other people, and just generally having a bad attitude. Most recently, James Harden has been up in Philadelphia with the 76ers, and that was an unmitigated disaster. He ended up at odds with the front office. He was over at a promotional stop in China when he decided to let everyone there know exactly how he felt about the owner of the Sixers. Here is James Harden with his deep thoughts about Daryl Morey.
Daryl Morey is a liar, and I will never be a part of an organization that he's a part of. Let me say that again. Daryl Morey is a liar, and I will never be a part of an organization that he's a part of.
Daryl Morey is a liar, and I will never be a part of an organization that he's a part of again. This is what he's saying over in China. Like, people are like, James, we asked about your step back three. Daryl Morey is a liar.
Wow.
So he's just on this. He's saying this while he's under contract by the 76ers. And so he doesn't really show up. He doesn't show up to camp. He says, I'm not going to play. He basically forces a trade. And so they have to trade him to the Clippers. And it's like the worst trade of all time. Now, James Harden is an extremely, extremely talented offensive basketball player. He might be good at defense, but he never plays it.
Wow.
So, yes, I mean, he can score 50 points in a game. If he wants to, he can score 50 points in a game. That's tempting. So the Clippers get him. In exchange, the 76ers get like an IOU and a Cracker Barrel gift card. Like that's basically the trade that got made. Here on Bleacher Report, it talks about the trade. 3 instant reactions to rumored James Harden trade between Clippers and 76ers. For the third time in less than 3 calendar years, James Harden has gotten his wish and forced a trade out of his current situation. That alone, red flag. For the third time in less than 3 calendar years, James Harden has gotten his way by forcing a trade out of his current situation. The 76ers traded Harden to the Los Angeles Clippers early Tuesday morning in a blockbuster that will send Marcus Morris, Robert Covington, Nick Batum, KJ Martin, a protected 2026 first round pick, a whole bunch of other things that don't matter. The trade ends 4 months worth of rumors and provides an ugly end to the decade-long relationship between Harden and Sixers president of basketball operations, Daryl Morey. Harden requested a trade in June amid frustration with the lack of urgency for Morey to offer him a long-term contract. The subsequent months saw Harden call Morey a liar in a promotional appearance in China, resulting in a $100,000 fine, and then liken their relationship to a marriage while refusing to call Morey by his name. Me and the front office had a very, very good relationship for a decade. Harden said earlier this month, there was a constant communication. You know what I mean? There was no communication once we lost to the Boston Celtics in the second round of the 2023 playoffs. With the latest Harden drama finally behind us, let's take a look at what this deal means for both teams moving forward, and goes on to give some hot takes about what it might mean for everybody involved. When it comes to the Clippers, they had to make this trade, but they have a potential Westbrook problem. Now, remember, Russell Westbrook and James Harden, they started together on the same team. They had to make this trade. They acquired an all-star who led the NBA in assists last season for a bologna sandwich. Nice.
Wow.
It's the type of trade that, if attempted in 2K, your PS5 would have spontaneously caught on fire. Harden torpedoed his value to the point that the Clippers underwhelming offer were Morey's only option to end this saga. And now comes the hard part. And the hard part is, to sum it up, taking this player who is known to be full of drama, who is known to be toxic in a locker room, who is known to not facilitate the ball well in an offense, who is known not to play defense, who is unbelievably skilled but unbelievably toxic, and trying to integrate him on this team. Russell Westbrook has had some rough seasons and is finally playing great basketball because he has taken a smaller role. He's actually playing his role on the team. And now with Harden coming in, it probably moves Westbrook to the bench, egos flare once again, and there's just potentially all kinds of problems. The Apostle Paul describes the church as the body of Christ. He says in 2 Corinthians 12, for just as the body is one and has many parts, and all the parts of that body, though many, are one body, so also is Christ. And importantly, he says, so if one member suffers, all the members suffer with it. And if one member is honored, then all the members rejoice with it. And this, of course, is Paul describing the local church, the body of Christ. If you have one member who suffers, everyone suffers. And, you know, I use the analogy when I preach on that passage of Shaquille O'Neal, the most dominant basketball player of all time. I mean, really, literally nobody could stop him. And yet, he had this stretch of seasons where he became ineffective and had to miss a lot of games because of an injury. And the injury wasn't a pulled hamstring, and the injury wasn't a slipped disc. The injury was his big toe. He had serious big toe problems. And now his big toe is like bigger than your thumb, right? So his big toe is a big toe. It's still one of the smaller members of his body. And that big toe would sideline the most powerful player in the NBA, because when one member suffers, everybody suffers. And the same thing is true in a sports organization and on a sports team. And basketball is unique because there's only 5 people on the court at one time, and there's usually only like 12 to 15 people on an entire roster. It's a very small group of people to introduce one potentially toxic player. That one potentially toxic player can make the entire team suffer seriously and dramatically. There is one of Aesop's fables, and these are like these fables for children that were told in the ancient world, but they have so much relevance and so much wisdom inside of them. This one's called The Farmer and the Snake. A farmer walked through his field one cold winter morning. On the ground lay a snake, stiff and frozen with the cold. The farmer knew how deadly the snake could be, and yet he picked it up and he put it in his bosom to warm it back to life. And the snake soon revived, and when it had had enough strength, bit the man who had been so kind to it. And the bite was deadly, and the farmer felt that he must die. And as he drew his last breath, he said to those standing around him, learn from my fate not to take pity on a scoundrel. So there are a lot of different types of people that you can bring into your organization and still thrive. And in fact, you need a wide, diverse, like life experience and personality and temperament and age. You need a lot of diversity of skill set and specification. The one thing you cannot bring into your organization is a snake. And as much pity as you might feel on that snake, or as much as you might see their potential skill set or their competency, if you bring a snake in, eventually you will get bitten. When you hire, you typically consider these 3 broad categories. In any hiring decision, you must consider not only competency, but also culture and character. When I say culture, I'm talking about the culture that you are trying to create within your organization, or in the NBA's case, the culture that you're trying to create on your team. And if you're a good leader, you're focused on culture. And cultures are protected by values, and values only matter if everybody aspires to them. And so you have competency, which is like, can you do the job? And James Harden can do the freaking job, okay? James Harden can put the ball in the basket. That's the job. He is competent. He's one of the greatest offensive scorers who's ever touched a basketball, okay? He's competent. But you also have to assess culture. Do they fit here? We have a culture of hard work. We have a culture of selflessness. We have a culture of humility. We have a culture of open communication. We have a culture of healthy conflict. Is he someone who can come in and do that? We have a culture of putting the mission ahead of our own personal stat line, right? Can he do all those things? And then there is character. Is this someone who cares? Is this someone who can put others before themselves? Is this someone who I can trust? So competency, culture, and character. If someone is highly competent, but they lack character, or they're highly competent, but you know they will harm your culture, you cannot make that hire. And I think that oftentimes we get blinded by competency. Someone is just so good at what they do. And so we see that snake and nobody else wants them and they've been left out to freeze. And we just think, and it's pride, it's hubris on our side to think, oh man, I can take this snake in if I just warm him up, if I just treat him right, if I just pay him enough, if I just give him the starting job, if I just let them not play defense at all and shoot every time they touch the ball and not facilitate the offense at all. If I can just take this snake in and they can see how much I care about him, then, oh man, they're going to be so appreciative and I'm going to be the one who can finally fix them. And guess what? You can't. A snake is a snake and they have to change. And change doesn't happen by just a shift in situation. Change happens from the inside out. Change happens with a transformation of character. And you hire people not just based blindly on competency. You hire them based on proven past performance in competency, in character, and in the ability to actually uphold the culture that you're trying to create. Andrew Cuomo was just on Bill Maher. We have a Bill Maher heavy episode on episode 38 of the Clayton Tyner podcast today. And Bill Maher, who has always been a pretty liberal commentator, and now he seems to be more centrist. And if you ask him, it's not because he's moved to the right. It's because the culture has all kind of ran really far to the left. But he ended up playing interrogator to Andrew Cuomo's COVID policies. And Cuomo, of course, was the governor of New York when COVID first hit, and he got a lot of attention. A lot of people were almost assuming that he would become the next president because he was so much in the spotlight during the COVID time. And eventually he was kicked out of office and kind of disgraced for different allegations of sexual harassment and things like that. But he's on Bill Maher's Overtime, his television show on HBO. And Bill is going to ask him some pretty direct questions and give him the opportunity to come clean and apologize and own how he handled specifically taking the elderly people of New York who had COVID and putting them back into the nursing homes. And let's see how Andrew Cuomo responds.
Governor Cuomo, knowing what you know now, is there anything you would change about the way you would administration handled COVID? Okay, that's the question we didn't get to. And I was going to read you the...
Is there anything you would have changed knowing what you know now about how you handled COVID? Let's see what he has to say.
ProPublica statement, which they basically said New York was the only state. Now, of course, the scandal, the issue involved that people don't remember is that, you know, obviously this is the beginning of the pandemic. Everything was chaotic. We didn't know what was going on, but we did know this. It mostly affected the elderly people, like most pathogens do. They were the most vulnerable. So you allowed people who had been in the hospital, older people from a nursing home, now they go to the hospital, to go back into the nursing home without testing them. That ProPublica says you were the only state to do it without testing them when they went back into the nursing home. And that's what caused such death in the nursing home.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Okay, so this is easy. Is that true? Everyone's reported on this. Everybody knows this. There's been lawsuits proving this. This is a softball. And Andrew Cuomo, who was not going to go away forever, you know, however much trouble politicians get in, you just give them a little bit of time and all of a sudden, we're back. We knew he was going to be back. And this is a softball. I mean, lobbed, underhand, right over the plate, falling at the exact angle. All you have to do is just wind up. You can step into it, right? You can literally step into this one, knock it out of the park and just go, you know what? I would have done things much differently. Knowing what we know now, I'm embarrassed by how we handled this. To the people of New York, I wish that I would have taken more outside counsel. I felt like I was doing the right thing, but in retrospect, it was not the right thing. And I want to deeply and seriously apologize. And is that what our politicians do? No, of course not. They never do this. They can never admit when they're wrong. And so let's see how he spins this.
Short answer is no. Also, remember, you say what we knew. First, this is Monday morning quarterbacking, by which I could make the New York Jets champion, right? If we could do this. When COVID started.
Now, for sure, this doesn't matter, but for sure, he thought that was a laugh line. You can tell because he even paused. Monday morning quarterback, I can make the Jets the champions. Pause for laughter. That doesn't happen. This was scripted. He was ready for this. And he is going to continue to obfuscate and not take responsibility.
It was, all the disinformation was amazing, right? It was coming from China, wet market, zootropic virus. It was going to California and state of Washington. So we banned travel to China, from China. It turned out that China had already spread it to Europe. All the European flights were coming to New York.
Now, you have to be careful when you listen to politicians, because if you just listen to this answer, you would think that the question someone asked him was, the way that the virus entered America seems to be different than we anticipated. What are your thoughts about that? He has just turned this into a question that nobody asked him, and he's not addressing the question head on at all.
JFK. So it had been here for months, and it was astronomical. When we first found out about it, and Scott can appreciate this, they were projecting we would need 150,000 hospital beds.
Not the question.
To deal with the number of infected.
I remember.
We only had 50,000 in the entire state of New York. So we
did it to free up beds.
We were afraid of losing hospital beds, but people who were in hospitals, who were considered medically stable, who were tested, were sent to nursing homes if the nursing home said they could treat that person in a way that protects the other people in the nursing home. And that was a way to make sure we had enough.
But it didn't,
beds.
did it? I mean, they also, the same organization, ProPublica, says you counted the number who died differently. In other words, you only counted the ones who died in the nursing home, whereas many people came from the nursing home and died in the hospital, and you didn't count those. You
Good for Bill.
They died in the nursing home, which they felt was deliberate.
Well, let me not get weedsy with you. Every day I did a briefing, and every day we collected information from hospitals and from nursing homes. And we printed two numbers on the screen every day. This is the number of people who died in the hospital. This is the number of people who died in the nursing home, which means you had to go back every day to 1,000 hospitals, nursing homes.
Okay, this continues on. It was not my fault. The short answer is no. I wouldn't have changed anything. Nobody knew this. Nobody knew that it actually affected the elderly more than everyone else, 3 months, 6 months into the pandemic, except people did know that. We knew almost nothing about it, but very, very quickly, there was a huge percentage of the country who was saying, oh, this is really, really dangerous for the elderly who have comorbidities. And for everyone else, we just kind of got to mind our P's and Q's. People knew that. Countries made their entire policies based on that. Sweden was like, if you're old and have a comorbidity, you got to relax for a little while. Everyone else, keep working. People knew this. It was willful blindness. And this is what leaders, and especially political leaders, do. Has he taken an ounce of responsibility for thousands of elderly people who needlessly died specifically because of New York's COVID policy? Has he taken any responsibility? No, of course he has not. And he's not going to. He doesn't throughout this entire thing. Here is the actual article that Bill Maher continues to reference, the ProPublica article. It says, Cuomo still underreporting the total count of COVID nursing home deaths. This is from 2021. Hundreds of COVID-19 deaths among New York State's nursing home residents still have not been formally acknowledged by the administration of Andrew Cuomo, according to the Empire Center, a public policy think tank in Albany. Bill Hammond, an analyst with the Empire Center, said recent state disclosures of all deaths of nursing home residents, whether they perished in their facilities or at local hospitals to date, failed to include more than 650 deaths of people presumed to have died from COVID-19. Hammond said the state referenced the deaths in a footnote to its public data release, saying that it is still seeking to verify the official cause of death in those cases. After months of requests from state lawmakers, subpoenas from Congress, and a lawsuit by the Empire Center, the Cuomo administration in recent weeks has finally begun to concede that thousands more nursing home residents had died of COVID-19 than previously made public. Now, here's the really damning part of this whole article. On Thursday, now this is in 2021, Melissa DeRosa, Cuomo's most senior advisor on the pandemic response, apologized to lawmakers for the delays in making basic death data available, saying the administration was worried. Here it is, saying the administration was worried the death tolls would arm Republicans in Washington in what it regarded as a political vendetta against the governor.
Not the cap.
They were misreporting the numbers by his most senior advisor on the pandemic response's own words, because they were worried those death tolls would arm Republicans in Washington in what they saw as a political vendetta against the governor. They just lied about it, and they lied about it specifically for political reasons. And now he is having to take no responsibility for this, even though if there were any path back into most people's good graces, it would require taking responsibility and making amends to the best of his abilities for what he has done. The book of wisdom, this is such an important verse. Proverbs 28:13 says, whoever conceals their sins does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy. Whoever conceals their sins does not prosper. James, the half-brother of Jesus, he talks about confession of our sins. And interestingly enough, he actually links it to healing, like physical healing. It also creates emotional healing and relational healing and psychological healing when we are able to confess what we have done. Whoever conceals their sin does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces them finds mercy. Here's what was so interesting about Andrew Cuomo during this is that he immediately began writing a book. I mean, as soon as this started, he began churning out what was like a best-selling book about his response to this. And while the world is burning around him, he is writing a self-serving memoir about his great leadership that ended up being some of the poorest leadership in the entire country because of his willful blindness to the data that was in front of him. While Rome is burning, Nero is just playing the liar, you know? The story of Emperor Nero, some people think he actually started the Great Fire of Rome in order to clear out land to expand the palace. Many people believe that. But what we know about it is that Nero allowed Rome to burn and immediately blamed it on the Christians in that area. Did the Christians do it? No! They did not do it. He blamed it on the Christians, and it led to massive persecution of the Christians, and he seemingly did not care. And we don't know if this is historical fact or not, but the ancient rumor through the ages is that he was in the palace playing the lyre, playing an instrument, just kind of watching Rome burn. What does it matter to me? Andrew Cuomo won an Emmy for his press conferences during this time. He became a national celebrity during this time. And now that we see his policies failed, and it's not like a bridge didn't get built, thousands of elderly people died, and he has the opportunity to take responsibility, and he does not. Authority requires responsibility. And until you're ready to own your mistakes, you don't understand true responsibility. Leadership is authority and responsibility. And the fun part of leading is you get a lot of authority. You get to be in charge of things. You get to make decisions. You get to tell people what to do. But authority and responsibility have to come in equal measure. And the true measure of your responsibility is whether you can take ownership when things go wrong. Like it says in Proverbs, whoever conceals their sins does not prosper, but the one who confesses and renounces their sin finds mercy. And now let's get to our last segment. I want to remind you that I have a Patreon for the Clayton Tyner podcast. It is www.patreon.com/Clayton Tyner. That's patreon.com/Clayton, Tyner. Check it out at the link in the description below. You can help support this podcast, cover the cost of what it's taking to actually run the podcast week to week, and help it build as we continue to grow. And in exchange, you can get access to exclusive content, early access to some videos. You can even be a part of monthly live Q&As where instead of me just talking to you through a screen, we all jump into a video call together and get to interact with each other. So again, that's patreon.com/Clayton Tyner. It has now been a month since Hamas and their just insane attack on Israel. 1,500 Israelis dead, over 200 Israelis who are still being held hostage in the Gaza Strip. And the world has responded in force. And what we have seen throughout the last month is massive rallies and marches and protests that are pro-Palestine. We've seen these all over the globe. Here is one, I believe, that is taking place in London. Oh, this is in Washington, D.C. This is just this last weekend. Thousands and thousands and thousands, upwards of 100,000 people. Here is a rally that's taking place in London. Thousands of protesters marched through central London. These protests are typically calling for a ceasefire. Trafalgar Square. Protesters then staged sit-ins at stations across the UK. Now, the rhetoric around this is incredibly divided. It's difficult to sort through. By polling data, the majority of people in America are pro-Israel. That is their stance. And yet, when you look on social media, that certainly doesn't seem to be the wide sentiment. When you see what's going on college campuses, that doesn't seem to be the sentiment. When you look at the statistics of people who are 25 and younger, things come much closer to half and half on how people feel about this. And you're seeing a massive rise in anti-Semitism, in people's rhetoric, and in people's actions. It truly is a wild time. And Israel has launched a war against Hamas. And people are calling for a ceasefire, which you may think is a great idea, and you may think is a terrible idea. Let me say kind of at the outset, I hate war. And we're like a generation. I'm kind of a middle millennial. We just haven't really been exposed to it. We grew up with some wars in the Middle East, pre-social media, where we weren't seeing it and exposed to it all day, every day. Those felt very distant, and everyone was able to connect them to 9/11. And we just wrote country songs about, how America was going to go over and open a can on everybody. And I think the on the ground reality of what was going on, we were just very distanced from it. I hate war. I hate the idea of the loss of life. And there is so much confusion around the Israel-Hamas war, and people are using terms like genocide, and they're using terms like war crimes. And in a lot of instances, they're using those words quite incorrectly. But before we try to humbly diagnose what's going on in the area, I want us to try and understand some of the roots and some of the origins of them, because as a pastor, I've been talking to people in my congregation and to other Christians and to people who know scripture quite well. And what I've come to realize is a lot of people don't understand the ancient roots of what's going on in this disputed land that Israel has the majority of right now. But many people want back, and many people see Israel as occupying a land that rightfully belongs to Palestine, and Israel obviously believes the land belongs to them. And where does all of that actually come from? Well, to understand the heart of the conflict, you have to understand the history of the people, okay? To understand the heart of the conflict, you have to understand the history of the people. And the history of the people all centers around one central figure, the biblical person of Abraham. And Abraham is actually the central figure of three different religions. He is the central figure of Judaism, the central figure of Islam, and the central figure of Christianity, at least in the historical sense. Obviously, Jesus is the center of Christianity. It all comes around Abraham. And what I want to show you briefly is the story of Abraham as it pertains to this conflict in the biblical text, and then help you understand where that comes into conflict with the understanding of Abraham in the Quran. And so in Genesis chapter 12, we have the call of Abraham. And the call of Abraham goes like this. The Lord said to Abram, his name was Abram, later changed to Abraham, go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land I will show you. I'll make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you. I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, if you're a Christian, you see the end of verse 3 as fully fulfilled in Jesus. But in the current conflict, which is Israel versus Hamas, you have the Jewish understanding of what of what God meant when he said all the peoples of the earth will bless you, not the Christian understanding. It goes on to say, so Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, and all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired, and they set out for the land of Canaan. And when they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the site of Shechem at the oak of Moreh. At the time, the Canaanites were in the land, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring, I will give this land. And so he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. To your offspring, I will give this land. And that is really significant because both Judaism and Islam trace back to Abraham. And God said to Abraham, to your offspring, I will give this land. Now, as time went on, Abraham and Sarah, they struggled to have a child. And God comes in Genesis chapter 15 and makes an actual covenant with Abraham. And it's important for us to understand this covenant. In Genesis 15, it says, so Abraham brought all these to him, to God, cut them in half, all of these animals, and laid the pieces opposite each other, but he did not cut the birds in half. And as the sun was setting, a deep sleep came over Abram, and suddenly great terror and darkness descended on him. And the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, your offspring will be resident aliens for 400 years in a land that does not belong to them, and will be enslaved and oppressed. However, I will judge the nation they serve, and afterward they will go out with many possessions. But you will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. And in the fourth generation they will return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. And that is a prophecy from God about the Israelite occupation in Egypt, where they are enslaved for 400 years. He goes on to say, when the sun had set and it was dark, a smoking fire pot and flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. And on that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your offspring from the brook of Egypt to the great river, the Euphrates River, the land of all of the people in that area. I give all of this to your offspring. This is so significant. Everything goes back to Abraham, and this is a covenant, and this was the sign of the covenant. And in the ancient world, what they would do is they would divide these animals, literally cut them in half, and often they would dig a trench and they'd allow the blood to flow through there. And then two people would link arms and walk through the blood together as a sign of that covenant. And that was a conditioned covenant where you do this and I will do this. And so if I hold up my end, you hold up your end. What's significant about Genesis 15 is that Abram is put into a sleep, and there's terror that comes over him because the path is ready to walk to make the covenant, but now he's going into the sleep. He's not going to be able to make the covenant, but he sees the Lord walk through the covenant alone. And when someone passed through the blood alone, it meant it was a covenant of grant, or in other words, an unconditional covenant. No matter what, I am giving this land to your offspring. In Genesis 16, Abraham and Sarah, they grow impatient with the Lord and they try to take things into their own hands. And so just as a side lesson, don't do that. Trust in the Lord. Don't try to take control of God's story. Don't try to get ahead of God. Sarah gives Abraham her handmaiden, Hagar. And Abraham sleeps with Hagar, and they have a son named Ishmael. And as soon as Ishmael comes, Sarah is jealous. She realizes the error of her ways. She is not happy about this at all. 5 chapters later, in Genesis 21, finally, Isaac is born, the child of promise. In Genesis 21:12, look, this is in the Jewish scriptures. It is in our holy Bibles. This is so significant. Here's where it all diverges. But God said to Abraham, do not be distressed about the boy and about your slave, speaking of Ishmael and Hagar. Whatever Sarah says to you, listen to her, because your offspring will be traced through Isaac. Your offspring will be traced through Isaac. In the very next chapter, we have this interesting moment where God asks Abraham to sacrifice his son of promise, who his offspring will come through, Isaac. In Genesis chapter 22, it says, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, here I am, Abraham answered. Take your son, God said, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. And so Abraham got up early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took with him 2 of his young men and his son Isaac. And he split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. And on the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. And Abraham said to his young men, stay here, and the boy and I will go over here to worship, and we'll come back to you. And Abraham took the wood for the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. And in his hand, he took the fire and the knife, and the 2 of them walked together. And Isaac spoke to his father, my father. And he replied, here I am, my son. And Isaac said, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb? Abraham answered, God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. And the 2 walked together. And when they had arrived at the place that God had told him about, Abraham built the altar there and arranged the wood. And he bound his son Isaac and placed him on the altar on top of the wood. And then Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he replied, here I am. And he said, don't lay a hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your only son from me. All of this in the Jewish scriptures, Abraham as this central figure, God blesses him with a son, Isaac, and promises this land to his offspring, and those offspring will be through the lineage of Isaac. And Abraham has Isaac, and Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob ends up producing the 12 nations of Israel, and the Israelites now have the nation through a very, very, very complex political history coming back together in 1948, and there's all kinds of tensions involved, but it's deeper. And that's what we need to know. That will equip us with the humility necessary to know how deep the ancient roots of this conflict are, because hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later, the Quran is written. And it is the guiding book of the Islamic faith. And it is seen as a correction to those original scriptures. And so I'm not an expert on Islam, but the belief is something like Allah, God, the one true monotheistic God, revealed the truth to the people, but the people of the book, which were the Jewish people, they destroyed or changed, tampered with the original word to make it to where their people were the chosen people. And so Muhammad comes, and the Quran is divinely given to him in Islamic thought to correct the record on what actually happened. And what actually happened is not just slightly 4 degrees different than what happens in the Torah, in the Jewish scriptures. What happens in the Quran is an inversion of that very story. This is from a website called aboutislam.net. And with the research I've done, it seems to tell the story pretty fairly from the Quran itself. Prophet Abraham is a biblical figure that all 3 great monotheistic religions hold in high esteem. They are collectively Abrahamic faiths. Abraham in the biblical narrative is promised by God that his descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. And in the 21st century, more than 3 billion people cite Abraham as a patriarch of their religion. However, the biblical narrative of Abraham is distinctly different from what we understand from the Quran and the authentic traditions of Prophet Muhammad. In much the same way as the early Christians, Prophet Muhammad and his followers did not believe they were starting a new religion. They believed that God had revealed sacred text before the Quran, but they had been corrupted, asterisk, by the Jews. And Prophet Muhammad, like Jesus before him, was to lead people back to pure monotheism. It was only after the Christians and Jews failed to accept Prophet Muhammad's teaching that they began to view themselves as having the superior faith. The story of Abraham features extensively in the Quran. He is the friend of God. He is a Hanif, follower of unadulterated monotheism, and his first son, Ishmael, the father of the Arabs, is the son with whom God tested Abraham. And God did take Abraham as an intimate friend. That's from the Quran. And Abraham was neither a Jew nor a Christian, but he was a Hanif, one inclined towards the truth, and a Muslim submitting to God. And he was not of the polytheist. Then it says in Quran 37:102, then when the son reached the age of serious work with him, he said, "Oh, my son, I've seen a vision that I offer you in a sacrifice." The story of Abraham is mentioned in several chapters of Quran, and chapter 14 is named after him. However, we first meet him in chapter 2 and begin to understand his journey to faith in chapter 6. It's here that the prophet Abraham questions the polytheistic nature of the worship he sees around him. So here's where it gets off course. So the story of Abraham starts much earlier. We get this narrative about him in his father's hometown. He starts destroying all of the idols. Then we get down to the test. Abraham leaves the home of his childhood and youth. He has two wives, Sarah and Hagar. Now, in the Jewish scriptures, he has one wife, Sarah, and Sarah has a handmaiden who is Hagar. In the Quran, he has two wives. They are co-equals in their house. And he's well into his old age and childless. Although Hagar in the Jewish scriptures is Abraham's second wife, she is the first to bear him a son, Ishmael. And when Ishmael is old enough to work with his father, Abraham sees in a dream that he sacrifices his beloved son. He discusses this with Ishmael, and both agree that he must follow the commandments of God. We all know the outcome of the extreme test Abraham is faced with. Although in the Jewish and Christian versions, the son is Isaac. God stops the sacrifice and tells Abraham it was a test of his devotion. God had no need for the sacrifice of a child, nor does he need the animal sacrifice Muslims perform in commemoration of this act. He is free of need, another difference between the biblical and the Islamic Abraham. So this story is not just different, it is an inversion of the Jewish scriptures. And the way the story goes with the sacrifice of Ishmael, which, to be fair, early in Islam, there was some debate over which was the child who was sacrificed. The greatest evidence that it's Ishmael in the Quran is after the sacrifice. It then talks about the upcoming birth of Isaac. So it almost by default has to be Ishmael. And the story is very different, and it's told how you would expect a religious story to be told, where Ishmael knows about this and he encourages Abraham to do it, and he asks to be laid face down so that he won't flinch, because that would be an affront to God. And some say that the knife was stayed, kind of like in the biblical story, and there are more fantastical versions where people believe that like the back of Ishmael turned to copper, and so the knife couldn't pierce it or something like that. But what ultimately matters is that you have the same story beginning, and then it comes to a point and there's a divergence that is an inversion of the two stories. And so you have in Genesis 21:12, God says to Abraham, because your offspring will be traced through Isaac. And you have Prophet Muhammad coming hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years later to correct the story and say, no. The actual child of promise was Ishmael, which means, according to the Quran and according to Islamic tradition, the promised land does belong to the Palestinians. It does belong to those who are from the lineage of Ishmael, to the Arabs. And according to the Torah, to the Jewish scriptures, it does belong to the Israelites, to the Jewish people. This is a conflict that has ancient roots, thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. And what that means is it's bigger than this moment. And it's bigger than a ceasefire. And it's bigger than any one attack. And it's bigger than your diplomacy. And it's bigger than your foreign policy expertise. And it's bigger than your UN amendments. It's bigger than all of it. It's as big as these two religions themselves, and the very core of them, which goes all the way back to Abraham. The way that it works is that in Judaism, the promise passes from Abraham to Isaac. In Islam, the promise passes from Abraham to Ishmael. And in Christianity, the promise to Abraham is fulfilled in Jesus. You see, Judaism and Christianity share an exact common historical belief, And Islam is an inversion of that belief. And when I say Judaism and Christianity have an exact common historical belief, if you are a Christian and you don't know this, your Old Testament is the Jewish scriptures. It is what Jesus called the law and the prophet. It is the Pentateuch and the historical books of 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 2 Chronicles, and the wisdom books of Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the prophets of all the major and minor prophets. It is the Jewish scriptures. As a matter of fact, historically, we know that it was, I believe, 386 AD, the first time that the Jewish scriptures, what we now call the Old Testament, and the Christian scriptures, what we call the New Testament, were first bound together and called Ta Biblia, the Bible. We share an exact history, but what we believe is that there was a continuation through Jesus, and that what God initially told Abraham at the end of his call, and all the peoples of the earth will be blessed through you, that was fulfilled in the person of Jesus, who opened the door of salvation from the God of Israel to all people in all places. And so what about Christianity? If we look in the book of Acts, which tells the history of the early church, it says this in Acts 3, starting with Samuel, every prophet spoke about what is happening today. You are the children of those prophets, and you are included in the covenant God promised to your ancestors. For God said to Abraham, through your descendants, all the families on earth will be blessed. And when God raised up his servant Jesus, he sent him first to you people of Israel to bless you by turning each of you back from their sinful ways. This is a conflict with ancient roots. And although that is a humbling and just massive thought, there are aspects to this conflict that should be quite simple. I hate war. The loss of life should grieve all of our hearts. It should. We should not look forward to death and destruction. And the loss of civilian life, people who did not sign up for this, people who didn't want to be a part of this, that should grieve our hearts as well. However, when we say that both sides want genocide, we have to know at some level, just common sense, that's not true. There is one side that in their charter, and that is Hamas, calls for the eradication of all of Israel. And Hamas is a terrorist organization who happens to be the political leaders of the Gaza Strip, and they do not represent the views of all Palestinians. And you have to look at the polling to know what percentage they do represent, but it's certainly not all. But they do call for the eradication of a people group. Israel does not call for genocide. And the people saying that Israel is committing a genocide in Gaza, they're not being honest. If Israel is trying to enact a genocide, they're absolutely terrible at it. They're dropping hundreds of thousands of leaflets. They're sending millions of SMS texts. They're begging the civilians in Gaza to get to the areas of Gaza where they are not operating militarily. Meanwhile, Hamas is keeping people in the area. They are committing actual war crimes according to the rules of war that the nations of the world have agreed upon, by setting up their bases of operation in hospitals, under schools, near playgrounds. They're saying out loud, they're not hiding the ball. We are okay with women and children being martyred for this cause. That's glorious. They are saying what happened on October 7th, we will do this again and again and again. People calling for ceasefire need to be aware that a ceasefire was called this summer. And as soon as there's a ceasefire, all of a sudden it creates an opportunity. I'm not going to pretend to know how this thing plays out or the exact best way or exactly how Israel should execute this. I'm not a war strategist. That's not my profession. That's not my area of expertise. And my prayer is for as many innocent lives as possible to be spared. But we have to be honest about what is going on here. This is a conflict with deep, millennia deep ancient roots. This is a conflict where one side, Israel, would like to live in some level of peace, and another side wants them eradicated. And that's very tricky to figure out exactly how to get to. All of this comes back to Abraham. All of this comes back to who the person of promise is. And if you are a Christian, then your hope should be in Jesus. And you should understand and appreciate that there is a massive story that is told in the Jewish scriptures that we call our Old Testament that got us to today. And if you are a person of faith, then you should be praying for the people who are involved in this situation. This has been episode 38 of the Clayton Tyner podcast. We're on our way to 40. I'm very excited about that. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter at Clayton Tyner, and you can subscribe to the Patreon at patreon.com/Clayton Tyner. Help me just, help support this podcast, cover the costs of it, get some exclusive content, early access, live Q&As, all of those great things. I appreciate you guys so much for continuing to watch, sharing this with friends, subscribing, liking, getting busy in the comments, all the ways that you help feed the algorithm and put this in front of more people. I love you guys, and I will see you next week on episode 39.